I'm going to talk right now, but I got my jacket. Let me fix this. We're going to do the Sunday sermon. I could probably sit right here. I want to walk. Okay. 5 minutes. That wasn't that bad. Let's see if I can put my jacket on and do the Sundays. This is going to be the Sunday message for today. I think it's December 31st. Okay, 2018. I was debating whether I'll teach like right as I walk up to Church Unlimited, because my daughter texted and she's going to be helping with both services in the nursery, so she won't get out until 1. I've taught here before in this kind of a nice spot, actually, little amphitheater. So I thought, let me just do it. I wanted to catch, there's always a good worship song, 2 or 3 that they do. And I remember that brother did that one a few weeks ago, and I liked it a lot. So I thought, let's start with that worship. That way today you get a little worship as well as the teaching. And are they going to come up? Hello, brother. So let me cover the verses. I noticed Pastor Bill I looked at the outline real quick, and he didn't have any verses on the outline. So that also led me to just kind of cover the scriptures we're going to do today. That brother quoted James, I believe it was 4:8. A different version, but I'll give the King James. Draw near unto God, and he will draw near unto you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts, you double-minded, be afflicted and mourn and weep. But the scripture was, draw near unto God, and he will draw near unto you. That's the one that we'll have from Church Unlimited, okay? Now let me do I'll cover the verses for today's date for the Catholic Mass, okay? As I started reading them Friday night, I noticed there was a lot more than normal. And I try to review each passage from the Mass for today, and sometimes I'll try to read the whole chapter. But there were so many, I thought, I'm going to have to review more than normal. Sure enough, when I started reading the verses, I began with Samuel, and I read the wrong passage. Then I thought, now I got a whole lot of extra because I read the wrong Samuel chapter. But then I realized it was significant. So let's start with that. The actual verse for today's Mass, the one that was supposed to be read, would be 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 20 through 28. Make sure I'm on. And I read 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 20 through 28. But as I read it, I thought it was interesting because I had just visited with one of my friends, Furman, earlier that day, and the wrong chapter kind of fit in, and I thought that's real neat. But then as I read the last two verses of the wrong chapter, I thought, oh, this has got to be the wrong one, because if they end like in something in the middle of a conversation, I always realize I read the wrong one. But let's start with the wrong one. In 2 Samuel, the one I just told you, 1 Samuel chapter, it's Eli the priest. I'll cover a little history in a second. And he is telling Hannah, who is the mother of Samuel the prophet, which the book is named after, 1 and 2 Samuel, which I taught these last few years. And he says, because you have lent your son, Samuel, you have given him to the Lord. Therefore, God's going to bless you. And Hannah will have, I think, 3 sons and 2 daughters, it says. And then Eli, who is the priest at that time, he then deals with the rebellion in his household. And he has 2 sons by the name of Hophni and Phinehas, who are very wicked. And he tells his sons, he says, why are you sleeping with the women at the door of the congregation? They were quite wicked. And it says, I hear the reports from all these other people how bad you guys are. This is Eli the father, who is the priest at that time, rebuking his sons. And then he says something interesting in the wrong chapter, mind you. He says, if a man sins against his brother, then the judges can judge and they can deal with it. But if a man is in the position of ministry, priests or sons of the priest, he has no one to judge him but God. And I thought it was interesting because that happened to be some of the conversation I had with Furman and some of my other friends. And it was almost the exact wording. They kind of were dealing with just different ministries and some that maybe do, they kind of might be realize we all understand there's a history of, bad things that have taken place and in those sometimes in ministry and all. And some of the conversations these last few months or years have gone along the lines of, people will give an account to God, especially, John, if they're doing ministry and they're doing wrong. And it's known. And the report from many people might say, this is not right, this is not right, okay? Now, I'll give that in a general sense that applies to all of us, because we judge no man. But I just thought it was so interesting, because that was the exact thing that some of my friends were telling me. And then as I got to the last few verses in the wrong chapter, there was one that stuck with me that said, and Samuel grew in wisdom and favor with God and man. And that reminded me of the New Testament passage in the Gospels where it says Jesus grew in wisdom and favor with God and men. And as I closed that reading, then I realized, this has got to be the wrong one, because it ends that, the 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 20 through 28 ends kind of in a funny way, because a man in the middle of a conversation, a man of God comes and rebukes Eli for what's going on. And this rebellion within his household. Okay. Now, the true passage for today's Mass is just chapter 1, the same verses. And it's Hannah. I'll kind of cover the chapter real quick. It's hard to just pick a few verses out. But I'll link my 1 Samuel chapter 1, chapter 2, to this post, as you see it in a week from today. But Hannah is married to a man by the name of Elkanah, and he has 2 wives, okay? One is called Peninnah, and one is Hannah. But Peninnah was the wife of Elkanah, and she had children. But the husband, he kind of favored Hannah. He really loved her more. But she didn't have any kids. And so because of jealousy, as you can understand in a situation like that, at that time, I won't explain why all those things happened back then, but they had multiple wives, and that's the way things worked then. So the wife that had the children, Peninnah, she used to kind of like use that to rub it into the face of Hannah out of jealousy, because Hannah was more favored by her husband. And so they go to the house of God to do the yearly worship, which is where Eli, the priest, which we just discussed, and his kids happen to be serving. And Hannah is there one year when they're doing worship, and she's distraught. She's distraught because of the situation. She's distraught that she has no children, and not only does she not have any children, but her competitor wife has the kids and rubs it in Hannah's face. Okay? So she's praying. But that day she's praying, it says her lips moved, but no words were coming out of her mouth. So she was praying in her heart. And now Eli, the priest we just discussed, he sees her praying, and what comes to his mind? Hannah's drunk. Look, they said that about the Christians on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. You know, these men are not drunk, it's too early in the day, because they were filled with the Spirit and speaking in tongues. So Eli looks at Hannah and is going to rebuke her for being drunk. Why does that come to Eli's mind? You know, because his sons were doing stuff like that. It's interesting. And Hannah says, when Eli says, "You're drunk," you know, because he saw her sort of mumbling but not speaking out. And she says, no, my heart is distraught. She explains her plight to Eli the priest. And she says, I have no children. And her prayer was, if God gives me a man-child, a son, I'll dedicate this kid to God completely. And Eli does something good. He says, God's going to grant that request. And therefore, we read that in the right time she conceived through her husband Elkanah, and she had Samuel the prophet, which is the actual reading for today's day. And then they're going to go up to worship yearly at the feast. I'll read this, I'll cover this in a minute in the New Testament, all right? And as they're preparing to go, Hannah has her blessed son, Samuel, because it was a gift from God. But she made the vow, I'll dedicate him to God. I'm going to leave him someday at the house of God when he is very young. And he will remain there in service to God because God gave him to me like a first fruits offering. And so she tells her husband that year that they're going to go up to the feast. She says, no, I'm going to skip now because there's coming a day where I'm going to just leave Samuel there for good until he's weaned. And that meant at that period of time, sort of maybe like a 2-year-old child, okay? Not just real young, not just a few months. So then the time came eventually where Hannah brought her son Samuel to Eli the priest and left him, and God blessed her. And when I covered Samuel, there were some interesting things that Eli did that were still noble, though his sons were wicked. And though he was, if you will, not doing what was right in the ministry in the sense of some of the dealings, yet God used him to speak to Samuel. There's some famous stories, but I won't do them right now. That's the first passage. Now, the second one, these were a lot of readings today. Colossians 3:12 through 21. I'll just mention a few things. It's Paul's instructions to the church at Colossae. And it's sort of like the same that you see in Ephesians and all. Whatever you do, do unto God, unto the Lord as not unto men. Be ye thankful, singing with joy, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And then the passage on family. Wives, submit to your husbands. We read the same type of thing in Ephesians. And for the husbands to love their wives. In Ephesians, the passage says, as Christ loved the church, gave himself for it. And so that passage, why would that kind of be in today's reading for the Mass? Because we're reading about family, holy family, and God's dealings with family. Wives, husbands, children, fathers, bring your kids up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. But don't get them angry. Don't so they don't get discouraged. Okay? And I'll add my teaching on Colossians. The next reading again is 1 John, chapter 3. The first two verses, Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knows us not, because it knew him not. Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And then the end of that chapter, 1 John 3, Beloved, if our hearts condemn us not, then have we confidence before God. And we know that the things that we ask of God we will receive, because we keep his commandments. And this is the commandment, that you believe on the name of the Son Jesus Christ and love one another as he gave us commandments. John is simple. And this is 1 John, but John also wrote, the same John, who we know as the apostle, the younger disciple, he wrote the Gospel of John. And it's the last, two verses in the last two chapters of John's Gospel that said, many other things did Jesus do, but these are written that you might believe, and that believing you might have life through his name. John is simple. He was a younger disciple, and he's the one that tells us God is love. And maybe because of his youth, Peter, the other disciple, struggled with a lot of different things. Rough fisherman Peter, and Simon, a different disciple, but Simon the Zealot. I read this week on Judas, just reading through the Gospels. My friend Sweet Pea, Connie, was up in Timmins the other day. She's a good sister in the Lord, and she had a bunch of scriptures she was quoting. I should have done a little meeting with Sweet Pea. She watches our videos. If you watch this, I felt later I should have done a little teaching with Connie, a friend of ours for a long time, follows our ministry. And she was quoting a lot of scriptures. That's why I should have got her on video. But it was about the heart. And I told her I just read the night before a passage from John about the Judas Iscariot. And it says, after they sat and ate, it says Satan entered into Judas' heart. And then he sought opportunity to betray him. And it fit with what Connie was speaking. And the scriptures talk about guarding our heart. So the disciples had all types of issues they dealt with. But John, out of the original 12 apostles, was a younger one. And in his letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, you see a sort of, it's not, we certainly have good doctrine in those letters, but not like Paul had in Romans and Galatians, the strong doctrine of justification by faith. John has a lot in his letters believing in having everlasting life, which is the same doctrine of justification by faith. In John 3, he's the one who penned the passage. John's gospel is unique of the others. We call synoptic. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Then you go to John 5, John 6. He that believes on the Son has everlasting life. Who believes that I came from the Father. John's writings are more passionate. The doctrine of believing and being born of God is in John's gospel, but in Paul's letters, Romans, Galatians, and all, the theology is set out. Because Paul was a former Pharisee. He was not part of the 12, but he says he was born out of due time. And so he knew how to doctrinally lay it out, and he did it well. Romans, Galatians. But John has this passion in his writings. You believe on that Son and you have life. Okay? Let me go now. Those are the main passages. There were two Psalms for today's Mass, like two portions. See, there was a lot for this. I'm going to cover Psalms 128 in a second, hopefully. The next passage was Luke 2, 41 through 52. Today I posted a regular post and a video from last week. Those who see this on December 31st, 2018. I think I taught this passage just off the cuff on the video and on that I made last week, posting today. And it's the one passage that came to my mind as I read the wrong passage in the beginning of this little teaching, which was 2 Samuel, or 1 Samuel chapter 2. But the one verse is contained in this passage of Luke 2, that Jesus grew in favor with God and men. And this is the account of Jesus when he was left behind at the temple, see, the place of worship, like the family of the father and mother of Samuel when they went out. And that's how this passage relates. And Jesus goes with Mary and Joseph, and it's the worship time to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, and to thank God for the things he's done. And this is the only account of Jesus as a child in the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Besides the birth narrative of Jesus, you don't have him as a child in his life, except for this one, at the age of 12. And so when Mary and Joseph did their proper duty and service to God, they left the temple, they did what they were going to do, and they were on a day's journey away, and they supposed that Jesus was with the company, with the rest of the people that were coming back. This sort of like pilgrimage they made. And then Mary realizes, where's Jesus? He's not in the group. He didn't come with us. I had the friend Gabriel, who I had on the video the last few months. He used to be a son of one of the original brothers that helped me in the ministry in Kingsville when we started the church. Elias used to be in the jail, and I'd go and do Bible studies. His name was Elias Alvarado, and I'd do Bible studies. Kingsville is that way, about 30 miles. And I'd do Bible studies in the jails, and the guys that would get out of jail, they became part of the little church I started in 1987 in Kingsville called Christian Outreach Ministries. And so Elias and his wife Janie, they came to the church. And they got saved and serving God. And Elias was like my song leader. And look, when I had to work on Sundays at the firehouse, if I could not get off for those few hours, Elias would preach. And he used to be in the Air Force, became a very severe heroin addict. That's how I met him, because all those guys I work with. But he got radically saved. Also through the Victory Outreach, eventually became a pastor of Victory Outreach, and then died tragically. He had a brain aneurysm. And the day Elias had the brain aneurysm, I was working the ambulance at the Kingsville Fire Department, because we ran the ambulance and fire. And I responded to the call. I remember Elias was out of it, and Janie, his dear wife, was there. And I knew them both. Oh, Janie, sorry, dear. And Elias died a few days later. But at that time, he was the pastor of the Victory Outreach. And he used to bring all of his kids to our little church when we were doing services. And Gabriel was one of his little kids out of all the kids they had. And I remember one time, I think they forgot Gabriel at the church. And we were meeting in an old hospital. They said, oh, they had to come back and get Gabriel. Sure enough, I ran into that little kid 20-something years later, just a few months ago here in Corpus Christi. Not knowing what happened, and he saw my motorcycle one day, just hanging out with my homeless friends, and he wanted to compliment me on the motorcycle. As he walked up to me, he said, what's your name? And I didn't recognize him. He was like 28 now, or 30. I seen him when he was like 4. I said, John. He said, what's your last name? Chirillo. Gabriel started crying, because that was him. He remembered me. And he was basically on the streets. I have not seen him much. But it reminded me of when they left Jesus behind. And so the parents come back, and Mary kind of rebukes her son Jesus that day. This is Luke chapter 2 at the temple. And says, what are you doing back here, son? Don't you know we were worried about you? And Jesus responds as a 12-year-old boy. Says, didn't you know I would be about my Father's business? And Mary pondered those things. It says, then Jesus submitted to them, continued to be raised by them, of course, until the time that his calling after the baptism of John and covering his ministry would begin in the Gospels. So he submitted, but it says Mary pondered those things in her heart, because the day they came back and they found him at the temple, it says he was asking questions to the scholars and to the religious leaders, and they were amazed at the wisdom that he had at the age of 12. And how many religious leaders were there that day? They were older, and Jesus was 12. But there were supernatural things happening already at the age of 12. And then the day he entered into that temple court, some 18, 20 years later, and he flipped those tables. He said, my Father's house is a house of prayer, and you have made it a den of thieves. I wonder how many of that older crowd of religious leaders was there that day. He said, this is the one. This is the Messiah. We knew it that day he was asking us those questions. Okay, so those are the three. Let's see, the psalm I said I would end with. There were two for today's reading. I just put I think it's Psalms 125. Blessed is everyone that feareth the Lord, that walketh in his ways. For thou shalt eat the labor of thine hands. Happy shalt thou be, and it shall be well with thee. Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thy house. Thy children like olive plants round about thy table. That thus shall the man be blessed that feareth the Lord. The Lord shall bless you out of Zion. Thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. Thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel. Let's see. I think that was Psalms 128 that I just quoted to you. Okay? There were 5 verses. Did I have any notes? I'm glad we got to worship. Maybe I'll make one note, because I've been doing a lot of, these are all the readings, by the way, for today's date on the Catholic Mass, which I believe it's December 31st. It's either the 30th or the 31st today. It's Sunday, 2018. You could always go look those up. How long did we go there? My friend Furman, I was hanging out with him, and I saw my friend Andy too. I've seen him actually yesterday as well. But Andy told me the other day, he said, man, I got a gift for Furman, John. Did he show it to you? But he hadn't shown it to me yet, but I forgot. I haven't been, I can't remember that. I said, I think he did. He said, I got Furman a shark tooth necklace. Andy said, these are my friends on the street. Okay, now I didn't know the whole reason why Andy got him that. But then later that day or next day, I was hanging with Furman, and he showed me. And then Furman told me the reason it was significant to him was as he was hanging out with Andy one day, he told Andy, Furman told Andy, when I was a kid, John, that's something that I wanted. And all like the rich kids had him in school. And he said, so one day I was at the mall, Furman was maybe 12 or so, and he said, I saw one of those shark tooth necklaces. He says, and I decided I'm going to steal it. Furman told me, and I believe. He said, John, there's different lifestyles on the street. He said, and I wasn't like into the professional thief lifestyle, which some of the guys have been. And he said, that day when I took that shark tooth necklace, he said, I wanted one because all the other rich kids had them. And he said, then he got busted. They called him, the security called him. And he said, it's the fact that Andy remembered that story and for Christmas got him a shark tooth necklace. He said that's what was significant. It wasn't so much the actual value of the thing. It was remembering the story. But we're going to let us love one another. For love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God. Today, I'm grateful that you'll get to see the worship in the beginning. Obviously, if I have time, I might walk back in. I don't know if I'll have time. So this is today's Sunday message. I believe we hit on all the verses. I'm making some playlists right now, getting things together. And so I haven't had as many, friends that you hear. My homeless friends, my street friends, I like when you see them. Whenever you go, I'm working on things on YouTube right now, playlists, and I'll posted that like last night. But if you have a search on my YouTube channel, homeless friends, or friends. What you find on that is a lot of these friends of mine, some who have died, sadly. There's 3 or 4 on these videos you see me with who have died, and some have died in a short period of time. So remember, we have a certain amount of time to fulfill the mission. Okay? I'll end it with prayer. Father, I thank you for all of our friends. Thank you that they'll get blessed, God willing, today through the worship from Church Unlimited. Pray a blessing on this church here, as well as all the body of Christ in the city of Corpus Christi and throughout the nations of the earth, the people of God. I ask that the word of the Lord will go forth and that you would take a particular passage or message apart from today and speak to people's hearts. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.